So hello, right, images are coming in. Yeah, always good not to hide behind that screen if possible. Be very nice to see you. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, very good. Daniel, good to see you there.
Hey, Simon.
David, number one, how are you? Good to see you. And we've got lots of people in from New York as well. Excellent. Very good. Very good. So, as ever, we move quickly on. Randy's coming in from Toronto. Good to see you, Randy. We move quickly on. And to introduce Chris Wilkins, a forum member who you all know, and he has very kindly brought Nick Timothy to be in conversation with him this afternoon. The format, as we know, is they will talk now for 20 minutes. And please, we'll put a prompter into the sidebar for questions as we get towards those 20 minutes. But please do so, and then either put your hand up or I'll come to you from the sidebar. Look forward very much to this conversation. Chris, thank you so much. I'm handing to you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Really delighted to welcome my old friend, Nick Timothy, to Forum this afternoon. Nick and I was reflecting on this, we go back quite some way, I think probably about 20 years since we first worked together, but more recently worked together in Downing Street, as Simon was talking about on the call the other day. But these days, Nick is a columnist for the Daily Telegraph, also a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield, I believe, these days, but also an author and political thinker. And was it last year, Nick, that you published your book?
It was last year, but the paperback is out later this year.
So there we are. So Remaking One Nation, which clearly very focused at the UK market, but we're going to talk today more broadly because obviously we have an international audience. And there's lots of ideas and we could talk for quite some time, but we've just got 20 minutes. So I'm going to dive in. And the title of this talk, somewhat provocatively, is how liberalism broke the world and what we should do next, which leads to, I think, various questions. So the starting point, I thought, I was looking at, Nick, you did a piece for the New Statesman in March of last year, which previewed a lot of the themes I know of the book. And in that, and obviously we're just at the start of the pandemic, and you said the world as we have known it was coming apart before the pandemic began, you said. So I thought maybe we should start there. In what way is the world as we know it coming apart?
Firstly, thank you for having me, and nice to meet everybody, albeit virtually. I think it's true that the world was coming apart before the pandemic. The pandemic's probably sped up some of the changes that I've written about and we might talk about. But I certainly think in Western societies, we're seeing a sort of a double crisis. One is economic, where there's a kind of bifurcation in the labour market, the creation of a kind of barbell-shaped labour market, where you have got a lot of high-skilled, high-paid workers at one end, but also a lot of low-skilled, low-paid workers at the other end, and too little in the middle, which is partly driven by technology and trends in globalization and the way production networks have moved around the world. But actually, because some countries in the West have better protected their workforces than others, we know that it's not just those big trends, it's also the way in which Western economies set themselves up. And I think there's lessons there for countries like Britain and America and potentially others. And then the second thing is cultural. There's a kind of cultural crisis going on. And I say this as somebody who would probably describe myself as not a social conservative, but a cultural conservative, where we're basically losing our sense of cohesion as a society. I think this is partly to do with the economic trends that we've talked about. Inequality is one of the causes of this. Regional inequality is quite a big driver. But I think the increased diversity of values, which is partly caused by immigration, but also policies of multiculturalism and radical individualism, and increasingly the kind of identity politics that come out of the kind of left liberalism that's quite pervasive now, is undermining a sense of solidarity and trust, and that has pretty bad consequences for things like crime, but actually, the quality of life in neighbourhoods and our economic prosperity as well.
And big theme of the book and your other writings is your criticism of what I think you term as ultra-liberalism, and that being the worldview that's prevailed in politics, not just here but elsewhere over a number of years. And so, why do you lay the blame at sort of the door of the ultra-liberal political establishment, if I can put it like that?
Well, I'm kind of cheating a little bit because ultra-liberalism isn't really sort of one thing. And I should say, I mean, I'm somebody who holds the principles of what I call essential liberalism very dearly. I think liberalism needs to be saved from itself in many ways. And what I say in the book is we should think about liberalism as a set of concentric circles. So sort of at the core, you have essential liberalism, which is basically the kind of liberalism that makes liberal democracy function. So market economics, personal freedom, rights for minorities, checks and balances in government, and so on. But then you have a sort of an elite liberalism at the sort of second circle, which I guess is kind of centrism, which stands for things that the centrists think are what works and the result of evidence-based policy making, but actually reveal sort of philosophical assumptions and ideological assumptions, and which large parts of populations actually disagree with, whether that's high immigration on one hand, or whether it's market deregulation on the other. But then on the I don't think it's enough to sort of say there's a kind of elite liberal conspiracy or consensus that's doing down the general public. There's a next tier, which I call ultraliberalism, where there's a kind of ratchet effect on left and right. So the two sides do disagree with one another, and the right is intent on trying to sort of privatize and marketize and financialize, in the case of David Cameron recently, lots of public goods. And on the left, you have this obsession with militant identity politics and kind of smashing the institutions and traditions that traditionally have held people together. And they disagree with one another, but what tends to happen is one side will liberalize in one particular way, and the other side won't necessarily subsequently repeal what they do. They'll focus on their own liberalizing agenda. And the two things reinforce one another, and you end up with atomization and isolation and sort of social breakdown. And the sort of social breakdown and economic breakdown in turn reinforce one another. And perversely, for the ultra-liberals of the right, you end up with a bigger state then trying to pick up the pieces of the social problems that have been created.
And it's interesting they use the word liberalism anyway. I'm thinking of our American attendees here and how liberal there means a slightly different thing, I guess. But I think we're maybe to use a couple of examples then to bring this to life. One of the things that you, I think it's fair to say, criticize in the book and elsewhere is at least the speed or nature of globalization, and that being part of this trend. And it's interesting to just explore that a minute and think about, well, what in essence was the alternative to the globalization that you criticize?
Well, there's probably no alternative to the idea that technology is making the world smaller and bringing us closer together in all sorts of different ways. The way in which globalization has been managed and expedited, I would say, has reflected political choices. So, Tony Blair in this country used to say, you might as well argue about whether autumn follows summer as whether you should do anything about globalization, as if it was this natural sort of spontaneous process, which I don't think it is. In the book, I talk about the speech that Bill Clinton gave on the evening that Congress had ratified the agreement that effectively brought China into the WTO. And it's an extraordinary thing to read back now. It's so complacent. He talks about how America would be able to export more products without exporting any jobs, how they would be exporting the finest American product of all time, which was freedom. And he pokes fun, and the audience is laughing as he does it, at the idea that the Chinese were planning to crack down on the internet, and basically says you might as well try to nail jelly to a wall. Well, of course, not only has Chinese production led to the shuttering of tens of thousands of American factories, the use of internet-based technologies has enabled the Chinese state to coerce its population in ways that were probably seen as unimaginable some time ago. And the process of globalization has been managed through treaties and through institutions. Those institutions, like the WTO, might now be in crisis. But we made this thing, and we made it in a way that protected some people in the West and didn't protect others. So those in manufacturing industries tended to lose out. Those in service industries, more middle-class people, tended to be protected because the trade agreements never really tried to sort of reach equivalence over things like professional qualifications in certain service industries, in a way that they did sort of raise to a level playing field the conditions on which you could trade manufactured goods.
And so we might go back to China in a minute, because we talk quite a lot about China at Forum and our relationship with the Chinese. But just to follow this point through, so is it a fair sort of end point of this argument to say that Brexit in the UK, Trump in the US, etc., were they both of the same ilk, and were they both responses to this trend, or do you see them as different?
I'll try to have my cake and eat it there, I think. There are some similarities, I think, in that I think both represent a kind of rebellion against establishment politics and the kind of different forms of liberalism that we're talking about. But I think if you really look at the specifics and you understand the history of Britain's relationship with the European Union, I think it's a little different. Britain's membership of the EU was never popular. It was contentious when we went in. Practically any example of integration through those years was hugely politically contentious here. If there'd been a referendum on pretty much any of the treaties, it would probably have been defeated. So I think this is a little different. I think in many ways, I think the referendum result, it might have been a surprise in some senses because it was quite a radical change. But looking back, it wasn't that surprising because the country was certainly a significant section of the country was very consistently Eurosceptic.
Mm. And so to bring it up to date in terms of where we are, maybe if we do a quick battle around the different geographies. So in the UK, we've also got elections here today, very exciting, everyone's very excited, elections in London and elsewhere in the UK today. But it seems like Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are going to have a good day again, even though the Conservatives have been in power nationally now for over a decade. Where do you think the sort of two main parties are in terms of this debate? Has Boris Johnson captured some of the stuff you're talking about, and is Keir Starmer and Labour, are they struggling? Or what does the future look like for the two of them?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, because I think the Tories under Boris have understood some of what I'm talking about, and have recognised that there's a realignment going on with the British electorate, as I think there is among electorates across the West. It may be happening a little bit, but Boris has, I think, pursued the right kind of strategy to maximise his advantage with this realignment. And this, this realignment, as we've seen elsewhere, is based on the sort of traditional working class, the more provincial, less affluent, less educated vote that used to be the core Labour vote or centre-left vote, has left the Labour Party and is increasingly voting Conservative. I think the reasons for that actually originate on the left. I think it is to do with the abandonment of traditional ideas of solidarity and symbols related to solidarity, like the nation, sense of patriotism, an interest on the left in issues that frankly seem bizarre in some of these places. Who gets to go into whose toilets, and so on. And so the Labour vote is increasingly urban. It's younger. It's more reliant on ethnic minority voters. It's in university towns as well as in the inner cities. The Conservative vote is much more provincial, less affluent, and so on. And the really interesting thing here is the realignment is continuing, and actually the Conservatives won an enormous majority and in a landslide election very recently. But actually the realignment continues, and the Conservatives may be able to win even more seats that had been traditionally Labour seats. And I think the point is that as the Conservatives in crude terms move slightly left on the economy and become quite robust on cultural issues. Back to that distinction, not social issues, cultural issues. And you can see how it's possible for them to maintain their coalition of voters that have been Conservatives for a longer period, maybe more rural voters and some of the suburban middle classes, and their new voters. For the Labour Party, it's much, much harder to put together an electoral coalition that might take them to victory, because the issues that really motivate their core vote are literally repellent to the former Labour core vote, the vote that is bleeding to the Tories. Really, the best thing that the Labour Party could try to do is to try to shut down cultural issues as far as possible and bring people back together on questions of economic fairness. But as events are showing, that's pretty difficult to do, because cultural issues are now out there and they're not going back into the bottle.
I wonder what on that though you make of what's going on in the US at the moment, and the sort of start President Biden has made, where it feels like he has found some sort of response to this, or has sort of managed to close down some of those identity issues a little bit. And I just wonder if you feel that is he creating a sort of a new way forward in this sort of post-liberal world, or is he a version to kind of what came before?
Well, there's quite a lot to say to that. I think.
Indeed.
I think firstly, Britain is not America, and Boris is not Trump, and the Tories are not the Republicans. Now, I think there's a warning for the Tories in the way the Republicans have conducted themselves over the last couple of decades, because you can imagine it's very tempting for the Tories to basically continue with standard Tory economics, pretty liberal economics, that don't necessarily do a great deal for their new voters, and then periodically throw some cultural red meat in the hope that they will still vote Conservative, which in crude terms I think is what the Republicans did, and which led to the politics of Trump, I think. It's obviously more complicated than that, but I think that was probably one of the main drivers. And the Tories just simply must not do that. They seem to be showing a greater willingness to spend and to borrow, and in a fairly unstrategic way to intervene in the economy. But the question is whether they are prepared to be properly strategic in terms of regional policy and industrial strategy in order to try to get significant employment and good jobs in the kinds of places that are supporting them now for the first time. I think the other thing to say is, Boris is seen as this slightly sort of out there character, but he's not Donald Trump, and I think in as much as he made missteps in the early stages of the pandemic, many of those missteps were actually reflective of missteps made by the scientific advisors to whom he was listening. He was not behaving like Bolsonaro or somebody like that. His mistakes were reflective of the kind of technocracy rather than the kind of out there ideological attitude.
Yes, so thank you so much to both of you there. And I'd be fascinated if one or two of our American friends wanted to come in and just further that discussion with regard to Biden. But in the first instance, Jamie Lather-Pinkerton, can I bring you in now to ask your question, please?
Yeah, Nick, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I just want to go back to the points you were making about the various shades of liberalism, I get it's a sort of bit of a one-way journey at the moment, but I suppose the conditions in the West have allowed this to happen in a way, because come sort of 91, 92, where it seemed that sort of Western liberal democracy had essentially won through, in a way that the folks who occupy your concentric rings had been given a time of grace to indulge themselves and to, if you like, navel gaze their way to the situation we've got into. And in some ways, the pandemic, there is a difference between before and after pandemic, in that up until the pandemic, that 20 years of sort of, not without threat, but without significant global challenge had existed. I mean, we thought Russia was horrid and nasty, but effectively it was the economy the size of Portugal, etc. All the cliches. And indeed, we thought that China was somebody we could coexist with, and we signed all sorts of trade agreements with, etc. Coming out of the pandemic, I think those scales have fallen to a degree from people's eyes. And we now have, if you like, that sort of bipolar threat world again. And I just wonder whether, this another old cliche about external threat being a glue and actually making people drop ludicrousness and have to sort of focus on the task at hand might change things back a bit. And I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I hope it does, because if it doesn't, I sort of think economic decay and social decadence are kind of the harbingers of civilizational decline, and I think the West may be in trouble if it doesn't get real about some of the quite serious threats that exist in the world. And China's conduct, at the beginning of the pandemic, the secrecy, the way it behaved with the World Health Organization, the campaigns of misinformation, the sort of secrecy behind its vaccine program and the efficacy of its vaccine, I think has made the problem of China much clearer to a lot of people. I think we actually knew a lot of what was going on in Xinjiang long before people pretended they just noticed it. But I think these things are all connected. The realization, I think, when it came to things like PPE, the realization that we were so, the West collectively was so exposed to the risk of over-reliance on one particular country that wasn't necessarily especially well disposed to us, also became quite obvious. And then I think the way in which we've relied so much on the state, quite obviously, to protect us, both in terms of the health response, but the economic response through the various schemes that have existed in different countries, means that it's quite difficult to get back to the politics of before the pandemic. The truth about China is much better known. There is a greater awareness that things like supply chains need to be probably shorter and more secure. And you can't go back to the politics and economics of individualism after holding up the state as the kind of embodiment of the nation, and how we've used the state to protect us economically and in terms of the health threats. So I think the post-pandemic politics probably do reflect the way in which the West was probably moving anyway, but it's moved it along much faster.
So Nick, can I just bring in Daniel Widdicombe here, who's a great forum member and until very recently Chief Investment Officer at the China Construction Bank, and has spoken to Forum a number of times on China and gives us a very, very different perspective. Daniel, can I ask you to come in here and just give us your view on what Nick's had to say?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Nick, and it's been a fascinating comments, and it just led me your comments on the WTO. I think they're absolutely right in the sense that the West massively miscalculated, thinking that somehow a 5,000-year-old civilization with its own method of living would somehow divert course straight away to what we consider is the right way to live. And so that comment by Clinton about Jello on the wall is a great example of that. But I do notice that Western countries and their governments seem to score a lot of own goals that then create a kind of inevitability of their narrative. And I'll give two examples. The US, you mentioned, of course, that China shuttered jobs. China's manufacturing shuttered jobs in the US. But actually, I think it was US tax policy that encouraged US companies to invest offshore because it was much more beneficial. And yes, China was good at manufacturing, but it could have been Vietnam, it could have been Bangladesh, Cambodia. China was ahead of the curve. So actually it was a policy own goal by the US government and their tax structure that led to manufacturing flourishing offshore for US companies' profit. But it created this narrative that's been going on for 10 years, at least in America, that China has stolen American jobs. So I think that it was a policy own goal by the Americans that has led to this snowballing narrative. That's the first thing. The second thing is with Europe and Britain and Brexit, a lot of the classic fear of Britain's was on the immigration and of immigrants. And there were domestic government policy failures. For example, unlike Germany or France, we allowed all the East European immigrants to come to the UK and immediately get benefits straight away, rather than having to work and pay taxes for 3 or 6 months, like many other Western countries. So they had a higher burden or a higher hurdle they had set themselves. Now, what happened with that policy, with the laxness of the British policies, is it became a magnet for everyone, much easier to get benefits immediately. And it created the resentment of people who felt they were being flooded by immigrants. And then with the Syrian immigration issue and refugee crisis, and the threat of Turkey, which was a red herring, but that created a massive fear of immigration. And if you look at Google searches prior to the Brexit referendum, it's very interesting. The majority of them were to do with immigration. So what I mean is that policy own goals tend to create a narrative. And then we somehow blame the EU itself for existing, for our immigration policies, which were under our own control, essentially. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on those two.
Well, I probably agree with you more than you might expect, but not entirely. So on America and China, I mean, I agree that I think it's a combination of the process of globalization and domestic policy, which is why I said there are significant differences in the way Western economies and Western labour markets have changed, and that is partly down to things like education and skills policies, but it is also down to countries that have been more careful to make sure that their manufacturing bases are protected in different ways. I mean, protected with a sort of small p, not in a sort of protectionism sense. And I think while the way in which globalization is managed, I think from a Western perspective, needs to change in certain ways that might give a little more respite to Western workers. There's a lot that even in the existing system, Western countries can do to protect their own people and to protect their own lower and mid-skilled workers. I mean, on Europe, I think you're sort of right about the rights of EU nationals in the UK, especially when it came to things like access to welfare and public services for that matter. But this comes down to the European principle of non-discrimination, where you're not allowed to discriminate between your own citizens and other citizens of EU countries. And it's one of the many ways in which Britain was always slightly ill-fitted for the EU, because our welfare system is largely non-contributory. Our public services are free at the point of use and not funded through things like social insurance. And so it's possible it was possible for EU nationals to come to the UK, and because the British government had to treat EU nationals in exactly the same way as it would British nationals, they were entitled to things like benefits from day one of coming into the country. Now, within the EU, there were plenty of things that the government could have done about problems that the EU got blamed for. It could have introduced transitional controls on the Eastern European countries when it came to free movement rules, which led to extraordinary numbers of people coming over in the 2000s, for example. The Blair government chose not to do that. I mean, it could have reformed its welfare system and its public services to make them not in the way I just described. So they were contributions based, or they were based on charging in some way. But I mean, that would really be the tail wagging the dog if you were trying to reform your entire sort of welfare system or your health and education systems based on entitlements of newly arrived Europeans. So I would say that, yes, of course, there were things that British governments could have done differently and better when we were in the EU. But those examples, to some extent, show that the British state, Britain's institutional frameworks and so on, are pretty different to lots of European countries, and were one of the reasons why we found EU membership pretty difficult.
So,
Thank
Chris,
you.
we've run over our time, but would you like to conclude and to thank Nick on our behalf as well?
Thank you. Yes, I think we have run over, and there's so much more to cover, really, and maybe we could do another session. But thank you very much for taking the time. I think just reflecting on our time in Downing Street, and therefore where Boris Johnson has got to as well, it is interesting to look at the elections today and think remarkable that after, say, a decade and more than a decade in power, it looks like the Conservatives are going to have another good day today, and they've clearly tapped into something here which the opposition are struggling with, and lots of it is laid out in the book. So thank you for taking the time to take us through some of it. And I'm sure we'll have other opportunities in the future to delve in more detail. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you to all our Americans who tuned in as well. And Nick, it was very good to meet you, albeit digitally. And we look forward to seeing it next week. We have a talk from Singapore on Tuesday, and then on Thursday we're back to New York, where Baker, who I think is on this call, will be talking to Matthew Geitz around Bitcoin and crypto. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much, everybody, and goodbye for the moment. Bye-bye.